put out a grant and
Marcus there, isn't it?
yeah.
Now, as
So
far as the point about this is, as far as John goes, and I'll make a comment about that because I've got no idea how long it's going to take to read.
okay, so I'll just give you notes. I mean, I'll just do
give me the
that,
notes
but
anyway,
we're being
I
a bit.
can't stop it because I'm not familiar enough with the talk.
Okay.
So it's got to be okay, all right?
Mhm.
Is it unfair to the others if it's longer?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a
I'm
little
not
bit, but
familiar
we'll
enough
see.
with it.
Just say that and say if there's time afterwards, I might continue, but we will try to keep it condensed. But as you know, you don't know. I understand.
Okay.
So I'll just watch my notes just to give you an indication.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Alrighty. Well, ready when you're ready then, as long as we get touched.
Good afternoon, everybody. I trust that you're all alert, awake, not alarmed. I'm Marilyn Truscott, and I'm chairing session 3. We've got 4 speakers. One of them is in the UK, and I will be reading his paper, which is why I hope that you don't all fall asleep. Alan Roberts is a co-author of a book that came out that was for 2011, of course, our 2013, our centenary, is ultimately what he's talking about, but he's talking about the process a little bit as well. It came in at 4 a.m. in the morning, so I have not really managed to go through it in detail myself, and I'll be reading it. So if I start to sort of drone away or my voice drops, please all wave at me, please, because as I say, I have to be reading it. But I suggest the title to him, so Memory and the Heritage of Housing in Canberra, which was triggered by this process and this project. Houses are among the most ubiquitous and lasting elements in the man-made environment that contribute to a sense of place and our wider appreciation of our heritage. I, and when I say I, of course it's Eric, estimate that over 160,000 homes have been built in Canberra since European settlement, and there has already been significant replacement, a process that presents a particular challenge to heritage protection. Some phases of house construction have almost entirely disappeared, such as the building camps and humpies, temporary structures that sprang up from the inception of national capital development. Others have been much reduced, such as the more permanent hostels and hotels, and we saw an example of Acton with Tracy's great paper earlier, that began to appear in the 1920s. Paradoxically, a lack of funds and a growing appreciation of heritage has served to prolong, apparently, the life of some structures that began as temporary, such as the Prime Minister's Lodge, Government House, and the Old Parliament House. Reuse. Good quality cottages from the 1920s survive in large numbers in Forest, Ainslie and Reid and others. They are subject to heritage protection, but those built in Yarralumla for workers employed at the brickworks have gone. The earliest attempts at medium density housing around 1960, like the Currong Flats and the Northbourne Housing Group, are currently under major threat. I'll make a comment about earlier attempts of medium density later on. But the historical appreciation, but the historical appreciation of housing has been promoted very successfully by the ACT museums and galleries, the National Trust, and community heritage organisations, a process that began with the foundation of the Canberra and District Historical Society in 1953. The focus given by the Australian Institute of Architects to current housing architecture assists this awareness. There is a significant heritage dilemma with houses. How far should we preserve and respect our heritage from the past while also allowing owners to respond to the changing needs of the day? In terms of the amount of living space required, specialisation of rooms, fashionable style, adaptation to the environment, and to issues of sustainability and being the biggest houses in the world. This is a political issue with winners and losers. Even where houses may not have heritage protection, there are many pressures for protection from the community and from the families of those who designed, built or lived in them. The sharp reaction of Gail Tregear, for example, to the overhaul of her 1930s childhood home in the 1970s, and then its total destruction earlier this year to make way for a completely new house, is a case in point. A descendant may have strong feelings, but does this give them any greater say in the treatment of the heritage value of a house? Similarly, to what extent should we control changes to a loved townscape? We do not own the buildings and open land that make up our natural and cultural environment, and yet we feel a kind of ownership of them. Well, the public. How does a personal sense of understanding, appreciation, even a kind of moral ownership become a community phenomenon? Ultimately by legislation, but before that, by study, publication, and education. Canberra has been fortunate in the number of heritage architects and historians who have been involved in the process. I think particularly of the work of the heritage architect Peter Freeman since the 1960s, and the community historians Anne Googler, Alan Foskett, and Karen Williams, among many others. Their work continues. The most potent force for the historical appreciation of housing comes from the people who want to buy and live in them. And this has been most forcefully demonstrated in the way that residential communities have come together to celebrate and protect them. The Tocumwal houses of Ainslie and O'Connor and the Narrabundah prefabricated houses of the late 1940s and early 1950s were widely despised at the time as slums of the future. And there has been pressure to demolish them as they aged and deteriorated, but they have shown a remarkable resilience and community affection, a focus of community celebration despite the attrition of Mr. Fluffy houses. Significant community archival projects have been undertaken among residents past and present. Alan Foskett has been particularly successful in tapping this vein of community sentiment in his histories of the Narrabundah prefabs and suburbs like Campbell. Tim Reeves and I, Alan Roberts, have in our own way and modestly added to this accumulation that has struck a warm community response. Our book, 100 Canberra Houses, A Century of Capital Architecture, was given financial support by Canberra 100 and has sold around 3,000 copies to date. There may yet be a new edition, or at least a reprint. I'd like to give you a sense of our experiences of the appreciation of the heritage of housing. We did extensive primary research in the ACT archives, as well as later writings for each house. Our bibliography came to about 36 pages, too much to include in such a tightly financed publishing project, but which may yet become available under the auspices of the ACT Heritage Library. This research was indispensable. Among the primary documentary sources were accounts of the experience of the design of particular houses and of living in them by those who actually commissioned them. I apologise for the photos, I just put that up as a backdrop with what I could get in this room. Some of these accounts already existed, and some were prompted by our approach to those people. Probably the earliest of these were the memoirs by Helen Brackenreg, published under the title of Yabbies of Acton, that gave the background to the 1925 Brackenreg houses in Kingston, and by Merrill Hunter, relating to her parents' houses in Ainslie, built in 1927, and in Griffith in 1930. Others were Roger Benjamin's scholarship on the architect Alice Jelinek, who designed Benjamin's parents' 1957 home in Deakin, and the memoirs of original owners such as Graham Heap and Margaret Macaulay of their houses in Deakin and Garran, both 1967. These accounts were often written many years later and look back lyrically on a golden period when they were young people establishing their first homes. Many of those houses were built in the heyday of modernism, and a common comment is how lovely the house was to live in, as well as to look at. A pure pleasure, wrote Macaulay of hers. The visual intake from wherever you are in the house is of great beauty of line, form and colour, she said. Any historical source has to be approached with caution. I found this particularly true in the case of Winbirra, a house designed by Malcolm Moir and his wife Heather Sutherland for the ANU to encourage Mark Oliphant to become one of the foundation professors. The university architect Brian Lewis felt very put out that he was not asked to design it and did all he could to discredit it. This is all in the university archives, and it's very colourful stuff. The kind of material any historian would love to find. It was used in a biography of Oliphant and seems likely to be used again in a biography of Moir. But colourful or not, it's factually worthless, except insofar as it illustrates Lewis's propensity to be prickly, aggressive and self-serving. As a critique of Moir's design, it is worthless. Books have been written on the history of Canberra housing and on the architects who have created them. I mention Peter Freeman again in this context, as well as Ken Charlton's, where is he? Book on Enrico Taglietti and Dirk Bolt. And surprisingly, Milton Cameron's book on scientists' houses in Canberra. I could hardly believe when I first heard of it that there was sufficient in the subject of scientists' houses to make such a book possible. How wrong I was. We approached many people for their comments on the houses they had inhabited, and in some cases still do inhabit. We received enormous assistance in this way and a great range of responses. Some, like the former political Doug Anthony, who used to ride his bike to work, by the way, probably you all know that, were completely charming and helpful. But my co-author, Tim, found extracting information from Malcolm Fraser was like drawing teeth. Gough Whitlam was perhaps too far gone when we approached him, and his sister was feisty. When I told her of plans to mark Canberra's centenary, she said emphatically, "Big deal." Nonetheless, she was much more helpful than Gough. Many quite elderly people proved very helpful and had a remarkable memory for the information we wanted, such as the architect David Chancellor and the former public servant Ivor Bowden, who commissioned a house by Seidler. They were both able to save us from erroneous conclusions we had drawn from the often sparse written evidence. With a bit of probing, oral testimony from the 1950s onwards was surprisingly abundant. I can remember it. Some people were less keen to help, but very few. One lady declined any involvement. One couple was very informative, until restrained by a family member who was hostile to our purpose. The children of one builder were inordinately sensitive and sensorial over everything reflecting on the lives of their parents. And one man was very supportive of the project, but please, he said, don't include his house. He was afraid the publicity would attract heritage listing. I did see that bit at sort of almost 4 o'clock in the morning. That worked out well because we had to turn to another house by the same architect, and the one we chose proved much more interesting on closer examination. Incidentally, Tim Reeves and I, Alan Roberts, plan to deposit our research files with the ACT Heritage Library in due course, and urge the Institute of Architects in Canberra to be more proactive in encouraging architects to deposit their records with the Heritage Library. Okay, everyone? Our aim was to select 100 houses or house types about which we could tell an interesting story, each in the space of around 450 words and a 2-page spread, each one having a different emphasis or approach or significance. One would focus on a significant owner or occupant or a succession of such people, such as Government House or the Petrovs House. Another would focus on the quality of significance or significance of the architecture, like the Federal Capital Commission's houses of the 1920s and the Pettit and Sevett houses of the 1960s. We chose houses designed by virtually all the significant architects who have contributed to Canberra's housing stock, and houses whose architectural quality has been acknowledged through annual prizes by the Institute of Architects, including its 25-year award for sustained architectural excellence, or by Heritage Listing. Another criterion of selection was the significance of the house in the development of Canberra and changing concepts of what kind of city it should be. Yet others would illustrate changing design ideas or materials, and so on. They were not all to be top-end houses, but a comprehensive range, and there were not to be so many peas in a pod. Collectively, they were to tell the history of housing in Canberra in broad terms, indeed to a degree the history of Canberra and its place in the history of Australia. Ours was as much a social history as an architectural history, a history that focused on individual people whose experience resonates with Canberra people today. Thanks to Alan Roberts. For our next paper is by Barry York. And Barry will be talking about sharing heritage through oral history at the Museum of Australian Democracy, Old Parliament House. I should point out that the core theme of this particular session is heritage and communities, and we're about to have an example of that. Barry is at the Museum of Australian Democracy, Old Parliament House. He's an historian, and he's recording his oral histories of people who've lived and worked within the Old Parliament building, from builders to barmaids and the rest, if they can remember. Thank you very much, Barry.
Which one is it?
Top one.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent, if you like.
Good, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I appreciate it. I'll speak for about 15 minutes and finish off with a 3-minute excerpt from one of our oral history interviews. I've rehearsed, so I should be within the time limit, I hope. Before I proceed, I should point out that all of the oral histories that we have done at the museum at Old Parliament House include discussion of early Canberra. We always ask people that we interview, how did you end up in Canberra? What was Canberra like back then? So it's a very rich source of recollection and reflection relating to a whole range of aspects of the social life and the natural environment and the built environment of this city going way back to the 1920s. I think of oral history as being to do with the intangible heritage. People generally think of heritage in terms of artefacts and buildings. Oral history is something different. It's a tangible record of the intangible, of memories and reflections. And it can, of course, help illuminate our understanding of physical objects and artefacts as well. In Old Parliament House, we're interested in how spaces were used within the building and the political processes and the relationships and routines within the building. But as I said, we usually adopt a whole-of-life approach that includes how people, workers, ended up in Canberra in the first place and their memories of early Canberra. Oral history helps record the heritage of the subjective, if you like, not just interested in what happened, but why, of motivation, rivalry, intrigue, joking, drunkenness, romance, animosity, friendship, cooperation, the Australian public service. In a word. We're interested in the human story or dimension behind the official print-based record. Historian could read all the handbooks on how things are supposed to work at Old Parliament House or elsewhere, but as I'm sure we're all workers here, we all know that how things actually work can be quite different. and that's what we can get from the oral history record. Just briefly, oral history is a method of gathering and preserving historical information through recorded interviews with people who experienced the events and the ways of life of the past. And a good interview will reflect a dynamic interaction between a well-informed and well-prepared interviewer and a keen, thoughtful and eloquent interviewee. It isn't just a matter of having a conversation and recording it. As I said before, it's about creating a tangible record of previously intangible memories. And these, of course, are lost if they're not recorded at the right time. The ideal is to have an interview that is excellent in the level of technical audio quality. We're into sound archiving, in effect. No matter how good a transcriber may be, they will never capture the rhythms, the dynamic of the human voice. And that's where we regard the primary source material, in the actual voice itself, in the recording. So, we use very good equipment. That's a solid state 722 sound devices. It is to historians what the Magnum 357 is to Clint Eastwood. It's the best you can get, the most powerful and effective. It can record 40 gigabytes directly to 40 hours directly to the hard drive in the machine, and we also use Sennheiser microphones. We interviewed pretty much anyone who worked in the building when it was home to the National Parliament, 1927 to 88. We also interviewed people who are active in the democratic process, and that includes former parliamentarians. And we record people who knew prime ministers, usually staffers who worked for them. Our collection so far is 470 recordings, of which 90 are with former federal parliamentarians. They range in length from 5 hours to one with Doug Anthony, which is 20 hours, recorded over several sessions. The remainder are people who just worked in the building. We're strong in interviews with press gallery journos and political staffers, including former chiefs of staff, Hansard staff, switchboard operators, etc. Here's some of the people I like to photograph, the people I interview. And you can see that's Dale Budd down the bottom there, who was Chief of Staff to Malcolm Fraser. Hansard typists. The guy in the red shirt, Frank Jennings, the late Frank Jennings, Principal Private Secretary to Bob Menzies and Harold Holt. Excellent interview, that one. And the one-off type interviews with hairdressers like Lizzie Scott and people who attended the opening ceremony in 1927, of whom there probably may only be one or two left. How do we share all this? Well, we're embarking on a project to gradually put our collection online in full. And we have 34 interviews up so far. They're all open access. You can see our address there, the link to get to the online delivery. That's a photograph, by the way, of a woman who was 93 when I interviewed her last year. And it's interesting, we interviewed her because she'd worked at the Currajong Hotel and had a terrific anecdote about John Curtin when he was Prime Minister. But in the course of the interview, it became clear that her real story of historical value was growing up in the 1930s and 40s at the Causeway. Everyone knows what the Causeway was and is. And so it's an excellent interview on the Causeway and the community and how life was lived there back then. If you go to that address, you'll come to collection, and you can see there on the screen images. Each one represents an interview. The search engine there, if you were to type in hostels, you would find any references in the transcripts in each interview to hostel life, or Tilapia Park you might want to type in, or we're very, very detailed. We're using many index terms to ensure that people can use all this the way they want to, rather than the way we might think they should. There you get a better example. You can see the name of each interviewee, the length of each interview, and when you click on that, you get the full transcript as well as the full audio. They're just some more examples. You can see a few of them are deceased now. To wind up, I did say that I'd play an excerpt from an interview. This is Fred Johnson, who was born in Sydney in 1907. Fred was interviewed in November 1995 by the then General Manager. Fred was an octogenarian at that time, and his story of interest was that he'd worked on the building site in the mid-1920s. When you think of it, he was born over 100 years ago. He died in 2001. But we will hear a voice that was formed in the early 20th century that would have been taught to him by parents who learnt to speak in the late 19th century. And he's speaking about events of 90 years ago. So I will play this audio to complete. It goes for 3 minutes, and that will complete my presentation.
I first came to Canberra in the early part of 1924, and my father, he was a builder by trade and carpenter, and he was employed on a carpentering job with Hoskins, the steel foundry people. Anyway, when that job was completed, old Charlie said to him, "Harry, what now?" So Dad said, "Oh, it's a bit quiet." So old Charlie said, "There's a job here for you, Harry." My father said, "I don't know anything about steel." Old Charlie said, if you're any good, you'll soon learn, and I think you can. But he finished up as a foreman for a number of years. Well, then the boom started after the 1418 war, and there was quite good money to be made up around the Griffith and Leeton area with soldiers' cottages, so that and Griffith, that's how he came to move up there. Well, when he got himself settled down, I followed up, but as far as accommodation is concerned, it just wasn't there. So what we had to do was, when we came down here, was the tradesman's mess. The only accommodation that we had, no comfortable bedrooms, but we went under canvas with the temperature down about minus anything up to about 11 degrees, and our amenities block consisted of galvanised iron around and chip heaters for the any hot water.
Where was the mess located?
Where the American Embassy is. It was a beautiful spot to live, but as time went on, the family were going to come down from Sydney to Canberra. When the family came up, it consisted of 4 tents and a tent for the kitchen. There was no laid-on water.
That's in Griffith or Canberra?
That was in Griffith and Canberra. Not much better as far as the facilities were concerned, because here the cooking facilities were in the ovens, was those brick ovens that we used to roll some logs into the ovens, and by the time it was ready to go to bed that night, put a match to it and it'd heat these ovens up ready for the day's cooking. My father, he organised a committee that they employ the cooks and also to pay for the foodstuffs. So he used to strike a levy from the men to pay for it. Well, we stayed there until my father built in the first place when we had able to get a place in Queanbeyan, which we did. And then it was backwards and forwards by either a push bike or the sulky.
Tell me what old Parliament House looked like at that time.
Parliament House was more or less sitting in a desert, devoid of everything. So that it meant, as far as Parliament House is concerned, it was a case of starting from tours to build it up.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so very, very much, Barry. It's wonderful to hear it from the person themselves and their memories, and it's very evocative, very evocative. Well, we're coming fast forward to something that happened very recently in the excavation at Springbank Island. You all know where Springbank Island is, do you? Who's been there as an island? Who's there before it was an island? Okay. Anyway, we've got Lucy Blackham and Melandri Bjerk talking. Lucy is president of the Canberra Archaeology Society and a master's student in archaeology at the ANU. And Melandri is also at the ANU, undergraduate student, and she's president of Archaeology, Biological Anthropology and Cultural Heritage Student Society, in other words, Abacus. And as I said, they're going to be sharing the excavation and the role of the community within that. Thanks, guys.
So, I'm Lucy Blackham, as you just all heard, and this is Melandri Bjerk. The Springbank Archaeology Project is a successful collaboration between the Canberra Archaeological Society, the Australian National University, and the Archaeology, Biological Anthropology and Cultural Heritage Society at ANU. This project was funded by the ACT Heritage Unit grants and was part of the ANU initiative to create a local student field school. At the time, there were no local field school options available for students at ANU. Nor large-scale community archaeology projects common in Canberra and the surrounding regions. Springbank Island proved to be a great way to achieve these aims, providing a way for the Canberra community to be actively involved in the heritage and history of Canberra. Springbank Island is located in Lake Burley Griffin, as you all just realised. Before it was an island, Springbank was an area of land located adjacent to the Molonglo River and the eastern side of Black Mountain. Springbank did not become an island until the land's inundation in 1961 to create the lake. This is an important evaluation as the proposed Springbank Island site lays close to the original Molonglo River, which was a major water and food source for local Aboriginal groups. This landscape was relatively resource rich and a means of access to the limestone plains in the time of prehistoric Aboriginal occupation. The archaeological evidence has shown that these areas along the river have been the focus of Aboriginal occupation and visiting groups in the southern tablelands. The area of Springbank that is currently part of the island was originally high ground along the Molonglo floodplains. This suggests its potential in illuminating the presence of these groups in the area. Artefacts have previously been found by consultants and recorded along the corridor of Sullivan's Creek and Black Mountain, but the excavation of Springbank Island is significant in being the first attempt to excavate the Springbank homestead. The area of Springbank Island has significant historical importance. Being the first European homestead of Canberra and situated on one of the oldest land grants in the area, it was acquired in 1831 by John McPherson and has since then been owned by various families such as the Sullivans and the Kays until the final constructions and inundation of Lake Burley Griffin. And it also had the first European child of Canberra born on the property.
Alright. So the aims of the investigation included enhancing the collective understanding in both prehistorical and historical knowledge of the region throughout the excavations and surveys at Springbank Island. These aims involved historical analysis on Springbank, and these were in the forms of a literature review and collecting oral histories of descendants and elders. It involved constructing a site assessment based on both historical and archaeological investigations at Springbank for the preservation and conservation of the knowledge that was gained through the project. And finally, and importantly, was to increase the involvement of the Canberra community in the formation and reshaping of the ever-changing story of Canberra, both past and present. 3 days of surveys commenced in November 2014. Total station surveys were undertaken to produce a topographical map of the island, and ground-penetrating radar was used to indicate any soil anomalies which could highlight previous use of the site, such as the foundations of the homestead. These surveys were guided by historical photographs that were provided by descendants of the Springbank homestead. Excavation trenches were then selected according to these anomalies that were indicated by the ground-penetrating radar and based on the historical archives, including the photographs. Excavations ran between the 8th of April to the 17th of April this year. 10 to 15 volunteers were present each day, as well as supervising archaeologists. 3 trenches were opened, and 2 of the trenches provided material. Excavations were concentrated at these 2 trenches. The first trench was excavated 3 by 2 metres, and the second trench by 3 by 1 metre, although we ended up extending that trench due to concentration of materials on the western wall. The topsoil of all the excavation trenches consisted of non-local silts. Historical sources record large quantities of soil dug from around the lake being dumped on Springbank Island and then bulldozed. Both Indigenous stone artefacts from a variety of material sources and 19th century European artefacts were uncovered. A large number of lithics were discovered in the fill, indicating there was material being transported from other areas around the Molonglo River to Springbank Island. Lithics were also found in association with the Homestead deposit, suggesting both communities used this area in the mid to late 19th century. A great range of qualified archaeologists from both academic and consulting positions supervised the volunteers during the excavation. Most notably, the presence of Dr. Duncan Wright, the project coordinator, Mr. Ian Johnson, and Dr. Mike Smith was greatly appreciated by volunteers. Post-excavation analysis has started and is continuing. So far, this has involved Australian National University students under the instructions of Dr. Duncan Wright, Dr. James Flexner, Dr. Oliver McGregor, and Dr. Joe Kaminga. Throughout the project, we've had constant support from representative Aboriginal organisations in Canberra. This involved representative groups from the Ngunnawal, the Ngunnawal, Ngarigo, and the Ngambri peoples. This has been a great experience for the students involved in both the planning of the excavation as well as the excavation itself. Student involvement in the planning process was a unique experience in this local field school, and an opportunity to work with RAOs and Aboriginal archaeologists such as Dave Johnson is immeasurable. An essential part of the project was community involvement. Efforts were made at all stages of the project to publicise and educate members of the community about Canberra's extensive heritage pertaining to the area of Springbank. These included events such as the project launch, a community day following the excavations, and dispensing information through media and social media outlets. The launch party provided the initial platform for raising interest in the project amongst the community. It also provided an opportunity for descendants and elders to meet with project coordinators and volunteers. The Community Involvement Day was the combination of all the work that went into organising and publicising the excavation, and it was a great way to include members of the public in a project that was essentially theirs in terms of being part of the overall narrative of Canberra and its people. The day included excavations, historical talks, a chance for members of the public to converse with RAOs and descendants, and it also provided students with the opportunity to immerse themselves in the world of community archaeology. 100 people attended the event, including media representatives. The Community Day received welcome feedback from attendees about their opportunity to be included in the archaeology and history of Canberra. Many of them remarked that they were unaware of the extensive and rich history of the Canberra region. Such a project highlights the need for continued interaction between the public and Canberra's ongoing heritage. There was also extensive media coverage across many platforms, including television, newspapers, and online social media. The involvement of the media provided students with the opportunity to practice communicating archaeology to a wider audience. The skill is important in fostering community engagement and involvement with their heritage. CAS, ANU, and Abacus all took to social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, to make the wider community aware of the progress of ongoing events as they occurred in real time. The Springbank project was also highlighted by the ABC News, Win News, the Canberra Times, and academic platforms such as Archaeology Magazine and the Australian Archaeological Association. The Springbank project demonstrates the power that the student body and community organisations have to achieve positive outcomes for archaeological education at a community level. The project also demonstrates the interest that local projects can generate for archaeology as a discipline and as a source for local historical understanding. The project highlighted how sharing heritage can help to celebrate and illuminate stories of Canberra through access and participation in local heritage. Lastly, we would like to thank the community and project coordinator, ANU lecturer and CAS Vice President Dr. Duncan Wright for his continued efforts in the Springbank project and community archaeology. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I should get my trowel out. No, thank you very much. Look, we're a bit ahead of time, and that's good because we'll have lots of opportunity for discussion afterwards. Our next speaker is, we got it up? Pardon? Okay, fine. I finished. I'm just about to introduce Rod. Okay. The next speaker is Rod Butler. And I love your title. So what? Sharing audiovisual heritage collections in context. Rod's senior curator at the National Film and Sound Archive, and he's been there for some years, head of the Preservation and Technical Services branch. But I think you're not really specifically going to be talking to us about the technical aspects of it, but rather the sharing of those results with wider community and that involvement that you have. So Rod, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As I've been introduced, I'm the Senior Curator for Sound and Broadcast at the National Film and Sound Archive, but I have been there for more than 25 years now, so I can speak across a range of the NFSA's activities. And today I'm talking about sharing audiovisual heritage, or heritage generally in context, a challenge that I'm sure is familiar to many of you. Now, a heritage institution may collect, preserve and provide access to an audiovisual collection. However, as stated in Ray Edmondson's philosophy of AV archiving, audiovisual works are not made in a vacuum. They're a product of time and place and can only be appreciated as such in their proper context. It's also been written that the pivot of archival science is evidence, not information. So accurate conclusions relating to history and culture can only be drawn from audiovisual works in context, and this requires the original experience to be described or delivered. Now, it may seem strange in a presentation about original experiences to state that there's no such thing as an original experience. Creative experiences are always a dialogue between a creator and an audience. Experiences will be informed by an audience's culture, background, technology, and even physiology, such as colour blindness and hearing impairment. As a result, for each audiovisual work, there are always a multitude of authentic and original experiences. For example, you can never recreate how it felt to see moving image for the first time in 1896. Now, I can tell from the way you're responding differently to the original audience that you are responding differently to the original audience in Paris by the fact that none of you are running screaming for the door in panic as the train comes in to run you over. Now, heritage institutions also face many practical considerations. For example, providing an original film projection experience in Australia is very difficult when all of Australia's major exhibitors' screens and more than 3/4 of our independent exhibitors' screens have been converted to digital. Heritage institutions may also be constrained by legal and moral rights of creators who may restrict access to original versions of their work, in preference to newer versions. Before he passed away, Stanley Kubrick insisted that all celluloid versions of his films be destroyed and only digital copies be available as a way of controlling aesthetics and distribution. When a creator chooses to alter, replicate, or destroy their original versions, what constitutes an original experience? There are also technical considerations regarding the provision of original experiences. For example, some video formats were designed for display on obsolete CRT television technology. Now, this technology can conceal errors in the signal that are made visible by modern LED televisions. An archive has to determine whether the original experience is one that can only be provided with obsolete technology, or whether the delivery of a defect-free experience should be provided through further processing of the original content so that it can be displayed on current technology. And the challenge of providing original experiences is even greater when applied to works that challenge the concepts of permanence. UNESCO states that cultural heritage does not end at monuments and collections of objects. It also includes traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants. So a recording of an improvised work that evolves over many performances can only be captured at a single point in time. Also, Indigenous cultures connect past actions, people and the land with current and future generations via stories, music, dance and artwork. And each generation relives the dreaming activities, and an audio-visual record of such an activity can never deliver this outcome. So if you can't recreate an original experience, what can you do? How do we maintain our credibility as a source of accurate records in the face of these challenges, especially as new technology increases the potential for audiences to experience collection works without further intervention from us, the stewards of those collections? What differentiates us from YouTube? These issues have been debated for decades, and they are not limited to digital technology. However, the impact of rapid changes in technology has been compounded by an equally rapid decline in the industries that support traditional forms of preservation. At the NFSA, we have addressed these challenges by ensuring that all collection works can be experienced in their original medium and format, or in a form as close as possible to the way that they were originally intended to be seen or heard. Our collection works are also made accessible via other media, as long as the choice is given, when possible, between the original and the new experience. In cases when this isn't possible, NFSA ensures that the difference between the original and its modern reproduction is articulated. For example, the NFSA has been researching and developing methods to create new wax cylinder recordings. Now, this began when the Indigenous musical duo, the Stiff Gins, discovered our wax cylinder recordings of Tasmanian Aboriginal woman Fanny Cochrane Smith, which were made in the early 1900s. They were intrigued by the idea of making a new wax recording as part of a new show. This was done at the NFSA using an Edison Standard D model phonograph, which was held in our collection, and which dates from around 1908. Other accessories that were required for the recording process, such as a recording horn and a stand, were also in our collection. We also needed a recording diaphragm that we were able to source from a contact in the USA. Now, the last item that we needed was a reliable belt to drive the mandrel, because the original leather belt was slipping and needed to be replaced. Now, this was solved by using 1/4-inch audio tape, which had the same width as the original leather belts and held tightly to the mandrel. The recording process allowed the Stiff Gins to connect with their past through song, technology and culture, while also creating a new form of cultural expression. The recording was also possibly the first song recorded in 2 Indigenous Australian languages. The success of the recording has led to the NFSA to make wax recordings of other artists such as Gautier, Archie Roach and Keith Podger from The Seekers. We've created video productions of these recording sessions and that have been made available online. Now I know there's a lot of detail, but it's an example of the holistic approach that's sometimes required to recreate original experiences. In this case, we brought together diverse collection items, specialist and technical knowledge, networks, new media and innovation to produce this wonderful recording.
We are the Serious Things Collective, recording at the NFSA, September 4th, 2013. Waragabinya, Nyani Guna, Yanana, Namila, Ula Malia Bawali Indai. Lulu Bangbaran Nawigani Mulam Budu Ganga Nagaraki. Lulu Bangbaran Nawigani Mulam Budu Ganga Nagaraki. Kabainda Baya Pulamaguda Walwi Yalu. Kabainda Baya Pulamaguda Walwi Yalu. Kabainda Baya Pulamaguda Ganga Yalu. Kabainda Baya Pulamaguda Ganga Yalu.
Just in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. A flip book of the 1897 Melbourne Cup horse race provided us with a completely different set of challenges. The book was comprised of a series of 64 small photographs that, when flicked in sequence, showed the conclusion of the race. Now, to begin with, it was unclear whether the book was a byproduct of an early actuality film or a creative work in its own right. No other audiovisual record of the race is known to survive, but a moving image record of the previous year's race is held in our collection. Our engineers and conservators devised a method for photographing each of the 64 pages of the flipbook without damaging the artefact. We constructed a stand and a housing to hold the book and the camera in place so that we were able to capture each page as a still image. The resulting 64 frames were compiled and stabilised in our video edit suite. The final result was made available online as part of a blog, along with video footage of the original flipbook, which illustrated the difference between the original artefact and the digitised moving image experience. In contrast to the flipbook, we have a much better understanding of what audiences originally experienced when viewing tinted film. Motion picture films were first tinted in the 1890s. This involved the application of a dye to the entire base of a film to add colour to the title sequences or to represent an environment such as blue for night or an emotion red for passion or danger. Tinting became so popular that by 1920, the Society of Motion Picture Engineers estimated that tinting was used in 80 to 90% of all films made. And the process was still in commercial use up until the late 1920s. I'll move through to a piece of tinting for you. Prior to 2013, it was common for us to create copies of tinted films by creating black and white copies and keeping a written record of the colours used in the original. In some instances, tinted films were duplicated onto modern film stock in a system that requires us to send the originals overseas. The colours achieved were substantially transparent in comparison to the opaque silver images seen when projecting tinted film. Also, modern film stock colour space cannot accurately reproduce the colour range of tinted film. The NFSA carried out experiments with hand processing on a print of the 1907 film The Bashful Mr. Brown, using aniline dyes based on original Kodak recipes. And we developed a solution that was more authentic and much less expensive than anything we'd done previously. A technical paper is now available online describing the process, and the tinted films have been enjoyed at festivals around the world. I've got to show you the vegetables at the end. They're the best. Where are we? There we go. Vegetables are my favourite. So it's at this point that I have to discuss the inherent contradiction in my presentation. I haven't given you a single original experience. Lugging a 250 kilogram 35mm projector over here didn't seem like a very good idea, and I need specialists to play back our wax recordings. But I can offer you these experiences. On the first Friday of every month, we hold a vinyl lounge in our headquarters building just across the road. You can listen to vinyls from our collection or bring your own for us to play using our 1970s era analogue turntable, amplifier and speakers. Some people just want to listen, others take part in a conversation about the music that they have chosen and why it's special to them. Similarly, our Arc Cinema has the facilities to project almost all film formats. Also, just last night we held an event to demonstrate a new wax recording of a local Canberra band. The point of my presentation is not to downplay the role that digital technology plays in the sharing of our collections. I mean to highlight the importance of preserving and sharing context as well as content. The International Federation of Film Archives Code of Ethics doesn't say that we must always create exact replicas of original experiences. It states that we should seek to achieve the closest possible approximation. By applying these values, we've demonstrated that new and historical technology can be used, along with supporting documentation such as technical papers and blogs, to provide context for collection works, even in cases when it's difficult to define or even know the original experience. So I've posed the question, so what? Well, through this process, we've learnt more about our collection, we've improved our preservation outcomes, we've increased our relevance with stakeholders and audiences, identified new services that may provide additional revenue, and supported and energised our staff. Most importantly, we've delivered outcomes that allow for collection works to be appreciated with a true understanding of their history, purpose and impact. This not only respects the historical importance of our collection, it also honours its value as cultural evidence. After all, it's not our collection the collection items that matter the most, it's how they connect with people now and into the future. Thank you.
I always think it's so appropriate. Well, for me, it's appropriate with my memories of the Institute of Anatomy, where we as children used to go to the theatre to see children's films. Did you know that?
No, there you go.
No. Before it became the National Film and Sound Archive, the collections were with the National Library and then became a separate institute. But the director of that part of the library knew there was a film theatre over at the institute, and so we saw all these films over there. It was a while ago in Canberra, but anyway, so it's a sort of lovely resonance for the melding for me.
Yeah.
But stay right here or take a chair, and could the other three speakers who are here sit down? That would be really great. Thanks a lot. And we're ahead of time a little bit, which means we may have a longer discussion, or if not, we'll have a longer afternoon tea. Now, we don't have Alan Roberts here, and I can't answer any questions to him. But we're being recorded still, aren't we? Yes. So if you do have any particular questions for Alan, I think it would serve to make those so that they're recorded, and we can perhaps arrange that he somehow comes back to you in some new technological fashion. But any questions for anybody? Could you do the mic? Is that okay? Any questions for any of our speakers, please? Yes, up the back there. Could you use the mic? Thanks. Otherwise, it's. Can you hear it? We've had such a wonderful range of coordinators for this conference with different technical skills. It's just been really great.
Thank you, Marion, and hope you can hear me now. Fiona Rothschild, I'm an oral historian for the National Library of Australia, and I wanted to ask Barry York a question about choosing people to interview. Does the group within MOAD provide you with a list of people that you contact and invite for interview? How do you find these people?
The way we find them, the former parliamentarians that we interview are part of a cooperative project with the National Library, and we meet with the library twice a year and go through the lists of those parliamentarians, former parliamentarians that we know are still alive, and, you know, we take into account when they were born, what do we know about their current state of health, how important were they, and for the people MOAD interviews alone, namely people who worked in the building when it was the Parliament, it happens in a variety of ways. People might come into the building as visitors and let one of our staff know that, oh, we once worked here, we were on the staff of a politician, or I was a waitress, or whatever it happens to be. And the visitor service officers know to get their details for us. We might read about people in the Canberra Times. We once held a competition on the local ABC to celebrate our 300th recording. We've now got 470, but this was a couple of years ago, where we invited people to, like the ABC agreed to call on their listeners to phone in if they'd ever worked at Old Parliament House, and the lucky winner would be the 300th interview. And of course we ended up with a dozen people who were worthy of interview, you know, and so yeah, it's pretty much done like that, or word of mouth. We have over 100 volunteers at Old Parliament House. There's a lot of good feeling to the building, for the building. So we have many retired people who volunteer in the building, and often they have worked in the bureaucracy or whatever, and they know, oh, you know, I've got a friend who was a staffer or a tradesman or whatever. Yeah, so they're the ways in which generally it comes about.
I'd just like to ask the, I presume, archaeology students, are there plans to go back and do more work at Springbank or any other sites within the ACT?
So with Springbank at the moment, we're still going through analysis. One area we were talking about going down was oral histories. At the moment, because of how the island was built as such, we're not looking at going back at another field season. But the CAS committee has been talking about other sites within the ACT region. It's just a matter of getting in contact with people and hoping they want us to come out and have a go. But we're in good contact with Dave Johnson, he's involved with a lot of the Aboriginal sites around Canberra and the surrounding regions as well, and he's really confident and really wants to get involved with us as well. So It's just a matter of the committee and who we have involved, and we're always looking for like keen archaeologists to come and give us a hand, because we're all working and studying as well, so it takes a while when it's all volunteer based. So.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Rod to do some crystal ball gazing, and at the lunch break we were talking about, in your context, the engineers who were retiring and moving on, and just thinking about that fantastic point you made about collections bringing people together, and thinking about the notion of those citizen scientists who are populating natural history databases. Do you see that there's a role for the archives to play in citizen engineers in some way, and what would it take for the collections to go up online, or is there some other way that might happen? And I'm not just thinking about the archive, I'm thinking about all collecting institutions in general.
Thank you. It's great that you're so far away, because it gave me the amount of time it took for the microphone to come down here. I don't know how to answer that. Yes, actually, I think I can. Look, I think that this is the role of any holistic approach to cultural heritage management and preservation. I think that, for example, the National Film and Sound Archive is very active in Australia, but also overseas, particularly in the Southeast Asian and Pacific region, in training. And technology is so diverse, and the media that we deal with is so diverse, and the new technical and digital challenges are so diverse, that it's very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. People are at a different point on a continuum as far as preservation is concerned. For some people it can be, you know, if you use those milk crates over there to lift your collection up out of a floodplain, then they'll last a bit longer, through to digital disaster recovery. And in fact, I gave a training workshop at the ICA conference 2 years ago, and there were about 20 students in the room, and I remember at one point I think we must have mentioned algorithms or compression or something like that one too many times, because a woman from a local council just put her head on the desk and said, "Please stop saying that word." So I think that as far as technical and preservation knowledge is concerned, I think that now that technology is allowing everyone to be a creator much more than before, I think that there is a greater onus on us to provide that sort of basic level understanding and training. For example, we were talking at lunchtime about the fact that if you have material on magnetic media, the international consensus is that in 10 years' time it will be very difficult to transfer that. And that's not because necessarily the tapes won't be any good, but the ecosystem that surrounds it, the machines, the parts, the people who repair the machines, the people who can play. We think that in 10 years' time it will be very difficult to preserve collections at a large scale at a reasonable price. So not impossible, but in a sort of a practical way. Then moving on to, I think, the other part of your question, which was around how we bring communities together. I think that regardless of the collections that we have, I think that that's the thing that we share. And our Vinyl Lounge is an example of that. The wonderful thing about attending is that you can go from listening to someone's thrash metal record, and then the very next record you put on is a Korean folk song. And that only happens in environments like that. As far as online platforms are concerned, yes, certainly there's some responsibilities for people, and I think that is happening around the country. I know that in South Australia there's a greater push for there to be like a central point of entry for a range of different cultural agencies. I don't know, does that answer your question?
More questions? There's one over here. Over here.
on the subject of NFSA, preserving skills, technological skills, is there a possibility that NFSA could somehow form a cooperative venture with the original producers of those technologies, like Panasonic and Sony and so on, to preserve the skills, to preserve the equipment? And I speak from personal interest. I have a Panasonic multi-region video recorder, which I got originally because I was creating videos to send to my mother in America. So I needed to scan them in, convert them from Australian format to American format and then send them over to her. It doesn't work anymore. I have no idea where to get it fixed. But it's a really good piece of equipment. And it's worthy of preservation. Any ideas?
Well, there's a much shorter period of time between you asking the question and me getting the microphone. Yes, to a certain extent. And in fact, I was at a conference in Savannah, USA last year, the Association of Moving Image Archivists, at which they were proposing the idea of a centralised engineering unit, which I think is a fabulous idea. It's something that probably is more likely to happen in America just because of the size of their market, and also philanthropy is probably a bit easy to come by there. I think that as far as forming partnerships, we're talking about companies who still have a lot of money invested in their products. It's very difficult for us to be able to get under the hood of proprietary equipment and software. That's not to say it's impossible, and we're certainly working with some companies, and in some cases they don't even know that we're working with them. We had one of our engineers over at NAB, which is a big trade show over in Las Vegas, just a few months ago, and he was speaking to one of the people who make videotape cleaners, and was explaining to them how he had modified their machine to run much better, and they were thrilled. We're also working with, say, film scanners. Film scanners were initially created for the industry, but this industry is now not shooting on film, and so their film scanning technology is moving more to the archival market. What that means is that they're really interested in speaking to us, involving us in their research and development. So it's not just about how a scanner can be built to run very quickly and efficiently, but how does it deal with shrunken buckled film? How does it deal with black and white versus colour, and some of the colours that I was showing you there? So to a certain extent, yes. I'm not sure how lucky you're going to be with your Panasonic VHS machine, though.
There's lots of hands up. I want to ask a question too. Let's make a quick comment there, but we'll that one first, and then just a quick comment on that. I mean, it just reminds me a little bit of the fostering of traditional crafts and building skills and so on that we're doing for the built environment, or understanding the physical conservation, how earlier painters operated and so on. So that knowledge of how things happened in the past is happening as to whether it's enough or not. And we had one up there, and then we had Linda, and then I want to ask a question.
So was there someone here?
I'll just hold a bit of time back for me, sorry.
Thank you, Fiona again. A question for Rod, please. Has the cost of collecting oral history gone up? The reason I ask is I noticed that the oral history collection within the National Library is usually free to access, but some of the oral history tapes through the NFSA are subscription. One has to pay to gain access to them, so they're not free online.
Do you want me to go the long way around? Yeah. I'll come around this way.
He's well trained.
I can't even say I don't know now, can I? I don't believe that the cost has gone up. I think that that new technology has made it easier. And in fact, we're able to plug the output from our recorders directly into our studio. So the process of creating accessible copies is much easier. A lot of the oral histories that we have are restricted for other purposes other than financial. People might say something nasty about somebody and they don't want that heard until 20 years after they die or something. And then from a cost point of view, we're funded to provide a certain level of access. So where you can come to the NFSA and you can listen to material online, on site, or we'll provide curated content online. So this is where we're browsing through the collection and we're saying these are the stories that we need to tell in order to tell the story of the collection as a whole. We're not funded to provide individual copies, and usually the costs are associated when whether it's an oral history, whether it's a personal recording for my favourite film, my favourite song, through to people who want to use a clip for tonight's news or use in a documentary. Now obviously the latter examples, the costs are much higher. Broadcast quality copies cost more than domestic quality copies. Rights are usually involved as well, not so much with oral histories. But from a point of view of providing copies, I've been at the archive and was in charge of the collection access team for about 10 years. And during that period of time, my understanding is that we always charge for specific copies. So I don't think that anything's changed recently. Does that answer your question?
Hello, I just really wanted to make a comment and to congratulate Lucy. The event they had on Springbank Island was one of our very popular events during the Heritage Festival. And just to say that the theme for next year is discovery and rediscoveries. And so I'm hoping to see a lot of the organisations be part of that. And same with other heritage grants that we've had, that you will think about how you can get involved.
Like to ask all speakers, given there was a resonance between your talks, I guess engaging with many of you, with people working with you or those that you were interviewing, but I'm really interested to hear not so much about that as the people who've been going online and looking at the oral histories or having that experience of the film and sound and so on, and your experience with people on site as to what surprises they had as a result of the information that you shared with them. Did you have surprises in terms of their questions, or they didn't run out the room, I hear, Rod, but that sort of thing. I'm very interested to hear about the responses that you've had from members of the public with what you've been able to share with them. Thank you. And maybe the two archaeologists first. The ground up.
So just mean in regards to like the events.
Can you talk into the mic, because I'm renownedly deaf, yes.
Okay, so I guess in regards to what we did with Springbank, a lot of the questions that we found we got on the island on the community day was really around what they knew about Canberra and the history that it holds, especially Aboriginal occupation. That was a very hot topic, which if any of you know Wally Bell at all, he's one of the locals. He was very there to have a quick chat with everyone. It was good. It was great having him there. He knows a lot. And also just a lot of them had never been to a dig before, so they were getting into the trench after we dealt with it. So we weren't too worried about them screwing anything up as such. But you have that nervous thing where you're just watching everyone get in at once. You're like, oh, okay, let's hope this goes okay. But they were all just excited to have that chance to actually dig something up. And like one little girl thought she dug up a paving block, which didn't end up being that, but she was just so excited. Of course, she wanted to take it home, but she wasn't allowed to. We had to be aware of that. But we also had Oliver McGregor, who's one of the I guess he's not working at ANU at the moment, but he's working at Navan Officer. He does napping, and he was napping for all the different people watching there, and they were just so fascinated at how it's really old technology, and you can still do it today, and you can still get in and have a go. And it was, I don't know, to me it was a really great experience because it's actually made me admire community archaeology a lot more compared to, I guess, academia really. Now I want to get involved in educating people and being able to get out there with them and actually do a lot of those community event days, because they're the Canberra community is why we were doing it. People want to know about their history or who's owned their land before they have. And like, we had about 10 descendants email us in for weeks. They were just sending me emails upon emails about like who they know that had lived there, what their families had done since then. And it was really good because they were all really happy with how it was going. I didn't think we got any negative feedback from anyone, and it was really positive. We didn't even expect the media that we got and how interested everyone was in. And even it wasn't really, and it never really focused around what we were pulling out exactly, but what we'd already found with the research we'd done and the people we'd spoken to. So
I'll add to that because when at the community day, I was more involved with the kids, and what was so good about this community day is that it involved all generations, and so I remember just watching these kids at the end, because we had a little treasure hunt where the kids went around the island and there would be a poster up against the tree with some information about it could be prehistory or it could be early European occupation of Canberra or something, and after they'd finished it they would go, "Mum, Mum, Dad, Dad, so and so about Canberra," you know, like they were really interested, and I found that really interesting as well. And just that general, or like intergenerational, and everyone was talking about it, and it was really nice because all the descendants were there as well, and the descendants and the young kids of the descendants, and everyone was really kind of in discussion about Canberra's past, and it was really, really nice to be a part of that.
Thank you. Regarding the members of the public reacting to our collection, we have research fellows who draw on it occasionally. I think for me, we have the media who will be interested if someone dies and we happen to have an interview with them. Sometimes our interview is the only recording with that individual. But talking personally, what impresses me or has the most impact on me is when I hear from, out of the blue, I'll hear from a descendant, a daughter, son, granddaughter, grandchild or whatever, who will say, "Oh, we hear that you have an interview there with my granddad. I never heard him speak," or, you know, "I was too young when he died." And it really is. It's a really good feeling when that happens. It's probably happened half a dozen times only, but I then, of course, because we don't have a huge demand at this stage on our collection, part of our task is to get the knowledge out there that there's a bit of a gold mine sitting at Old Parliament House with oral history, waiting to be exploited. We don't have too much demand, so I'm always happy to burn a CD copy and just send it off to them with my compliments. Rayburn Tyndall died. He was a famous cinematographer, and it so happened we had interviewed him many, many years ago because he made a documentary at the Provisional Parliament House in the 60s. And we had this interview, and when he died, through the Australian Society of Cinematographers, we got a copy of that interview to his family. And again, they were really thrilled to think that somebody had interviewed him, and they now have a record of his voice, him talking about his career, that they'll pass down to their grandchildren and so on. So that for me is finest kind of response I get.
And Rod, you've had plenty of time for your
Everyone get comfortable.
No, we've got a few minutes until 3.
Okay. Well, I've got to remember I work in the context where one of our most valuable collection works is a man making chicken noises, because the earliest surviving recorded sound in Australia is literally a man going bruk, 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 bruk. So based on that, you never can tell what's going to be important in the future, and this is one of the things that has constantly been proven over the years. In the early 90s, I spent a week of my life preserving this 16mm film that was in pretty poor nick, called The Life Cycle of the Root Knot Nematode. And about 15 years, I just thought I'd completely wasted my life for that week, but 15 years later, someone from the CSIRO came around and just went, "Oh my God, you've got the life cycle of the root knot nematode." Similarly, we have footage of a large, I think it's a sawfish that's caught in Sydney Harbour in the 20s or 30s. And scientists tell us now that that fish is no longer in those waters. And they look at the scars on the fish and that tells them something about their predators, which are no longer in those waters. What does that say about climate change? You know, what does the erosion patterns in the background of a home movie say about climate change? Also, the personal side, I agree with you, you know, the privilege of putting on a newsreel of a man flying a kite, and it's footage of someone's grandfather who died before this person was born, and she's there crying in front of the television. Through to a personal highlight for me, which was being asked to send a copy of a home movie from Robert Menzies' home movie collection that depicted Princess Elizabeth as she was then, playing around, having a picnic, smacking the corgis, and I was asked by the copyright owner to send a copy over to the palace just to make sure that they were happy for that to be released. And I actually got a letter back from the Queen saying that, you know, she was thrilled to, you know, had a lovely afternoon trying to name the corgis and things like that. And of course, if I'd known that, I would have given her a nicer CD, you know, what I just sent over with something handwritten. So yeah, and I could go on. I think that this is the wonderful thing about cultural collections, is that they are important to many people for a myriad of reasons.
Thank you very much. I think, we do have one more question.
Who is it?
Graham down here. Maybe it's a question for Alan. Who knows?
Oh, this is to Barry. I was interested in your interviews, the oral interviews. What happens with them if something defamatory or slanderous or libelous is said by the person being interviewed? Does that stay in the context of the interview, or is it excised?
As a matter of principle, we don't edit at all the sound recording that we end up with, except in cases like that. And we always err on the side of caution. It has happened a few times. I was previously recording for the National Library. I've been in this field on and off for about 30 years, so you would expect that in that time occasionally it has come up as an issue. And if there's any doubt in my mind whatsoever, I go to my superiors and tell them, look, at the 57-minute mark, there's a reference there that I'm worried about. My understanding is that I, as the person who is making the recording, and the library or museum that then holds and catalogues the recording, any slander or defamation, then we are publishing that, in effect. So it's a very serious issue. And we'll get back to the person involved, and I'll relate an example of a former policeman who I once interviewed. It was a terrific interview for the National Library. This is before I worked at MOAD. I've been at MOAD for 9 years. It was before then. The interview was terrific, But then at the very end, I said to him, as I say to all the interviewees, "Oh, look, to finish off, is there anything else you'd like to say?" Normally they say, "We'd like to thank you for, the National Library for showing interest." Blah. This guy suddenly launched a tirade against his ex-wife. Totally unexpected, that she was an alcoholic, that she was doing all this stuff with other men, and she was much younger than him. She was still alive. And I just went immediately, when I handed in the equipment to the National Library, I said, "Look, there's this bit at the very end that's terrible, definitely defamatory and slanderous. What we do?" And what we ended up doing was, they said, "Well, Barry, you get on well with this bloke. Can you just ask him for permission that we excise that? We need the permission in writing." And I thought, oh, gee, I wonder what he'll say. The funny thing was, for all his adamance and anger, I just rang him up and said, "Oh, would you mind if we cut out that last bit about your ex-wife? It could get us into trouble." And he said, "Oh, sure, no worries. Just cut it out. I don't want to cause you guys any problems." But that's what we do. We would want to involve the person in that decision, and if they were difficult about it, we would have no choice. We'd have to do something about it. The interviewer can't take that risk, and neither can the institution or organisation that they're recording for.
Okay, thank you. Now, on that serious and rather ethical note, discussed over afternoon tea, I'd like to thank Alan, Barry, Lucy and Landry and Rod very much, and for your questions as well. Thank you.
But how does the university have them? So I just get cash. Would you be giving me a check?
Well, I can't give you a check at the moment.
Right, it was just a question. Yeah, do you want me to email you? Yeah, that would be fantastic. That's fine. That's fine. I just thought I'd clear that up.
I'm not normally like that. I didn't have enough sleep last night.
4 a.m. I'm not surprised.
Well, no, I went to bed about 2:30, and he sent his thing in, and I left my mobile on, whatever, because I had both